Are you real? Now, to most people, this question will just sound like philosophical nonsense, but according to one highly underrated Japanese philosopher who sought to expand on Nietzsche, it might hold the solution to nihilism. But I warn you, the ideas of both Nietzsche and Keiji Nishitani are quite the trip. But they do form a crossover that you could, I guess, describe as Zen-Nietzschean, which, yes, is exactly as based as it sounds. When you think about Nietzsche, you might think about his ideas on morality or his radical atheism, but what few people know about is just how close Nietzsche's philosophy got to Buddhism. Nietzsche himself voiced plenty of respect for Buddhism, calling it honest, among other things. But ultimately he sided against it, labeling it a life-denying religion for losers, or something like that. But Nietzsche was writing in the late 1800s. During this time period, the most popular form of Buddhism to reach a European audience was Theravada, which, to be fair, is a branch of Buddhism that's far easier to criticize on the basis of being life-denying, since its primary goal is to end suffering. And it does contain an element of escapism, in that it promotes leaving the world, which they call samsara, in pursuit of what is essentially a kind of heaven, nirvana. However, there is another branch of Buddhism, Mahayana, that Nietzsche likely wasn't exposed to at the time. Now, Mahayana Buddhism is much harder to criticize on the basis of being life-denying, because it says badass, scary stuff like, there is not the slightest difference between samsara and nirvana. In other words, there's no escape. Now, Mahayana Buddhism, from which we get things like Zen Buddhism, advocates for a participation in life, and thus has a fundamentally different orientation to Theravada. So why am I telling you this? Nietzsche never solved the problem of nihilism that he described. He advocated for an affirmation of life despite its meaninglessness. But there's just something about that approach that feels depressing and tragic. It's an almost comically Western approach to nihilism, what with all its pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But it's just not really a satisfying one. It really fails to answer the why at the heart of the nihilistic sentiment. And then comes Keiji Nishitani, a Japanese philosopher and also a big fan of Nietzsche's. Nishitani had the added benefit of being able to look at the problem of nihilism from an Eastern standpoint, particularly that of Mahayana Buddhism. And what he saw was striking similarities between Mahayana Buddhism and Nietzsche's own philosophy. His will to power, his perspectivism, his metaphysics of non-substance, they're all contained within Mahayana in a slightly different way, but very similar. Now, Nishitani, funnily enough, thought that Nietzsche didn't go far enough, and Nietzsche is often criticized on the basis of going too far, so this is, I think, the main piece of information that got me interested in Nishitani. So what is Nishitani's point? Well, where Nietzsche managed to look at the abyss and stare into it without flinching, he still retained his position as something that was apart from the abyss. And therefore, on the basis of this duality, he was always condemned to remain in a hostile relationship to the abyss. His affirmation of life was always going to be despite it, or in spite of it. Now, in Nishitani's view, Nietzsche was right to say that the only way out of nihilism is through it. But he ultimately said that Nietzsche's own philosophy failed to make that journey. Anyway, this is all a very broad-stroke summary, so to explain Nishitani's position properly will take some time, and it all begins with undoing like a fundamental metaphysical error that's been at the heart of Western philosophy since Plato. It's an error that Nietzsche himself saw, at least intellectually, but perhaps failed to fully recognize the radical implications of it. It's the error of the doer and the done. We live in a world that believes in the separation of the doer and the done. We believe that every effect has a cause. But what if that dualistic lens, despite giving us science and progress and all of that other fun stuff, is actually at the root of our existential despair? Now, in my view, this dualistic lens is fundamentally to blame for the phenomenon that Will Durant pointed out in his book Lessons from History, when he said, "We repeatedly enlarge our instrumentalities without improving our purposes." Now, viewing the world through a dualistic lens like this, that compulsively separates and divides the continuum of reality into discrete subjects and objects, separating the doer from the done, does, in all fairness, make us extremely good at predicting and manipulating material reality via science. And if you want to see just how useful this lens can be, I highly recommend you check out the sponsor of this video, Brilliant. Brilliant is one of the best ways I've found to actually learn how things work. It's a learning app that teaches you everything from math to computer science to AI through interactive problem solving. Instead of just flooding you with boring lectures and theory, Brilliant enables you to get hands-on experience with the subjects that you're learning about. You start simple with visual lessons that you can quite literally play with. You drag, move, and test different ideas until you feel it click. And when it does, you don't just learn something new, you feel like you've actually built it yourself. And that's what I love about Brilliant. It's like the opposite of passive learning. It's literally like putting reality itself under a microscope and watching it come alive. You see how patterns are formed, how systems behave, and why certain ideas are true, in a way that feels earned, not memorized. Now, if you're the kind of person who watches videos like this because you want to think more clearly, Brilliant is the perfect sort of gym for your mind to make that happen. It's bite-sized, rewarding, and designed to actually train your intuition over time. You can try Brilliant for free by going to brilliant.org/Angelo, or by scanning the QR code on the screen. And anybody who uses that link will get 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited access to every single course on their platform. Alright, now back to Nishitani, and what it means to say that the doer and the done are one in the same. Through the lens of dualism, we see the world as if we are self-contained subjects with a very clear separation and gap between self and other. In fact, what kind of defines something as not me is that I can see it. I mean, everything that we are conscious of is considered something that we are subjected to, and therefore must not be the subject itself, at least not in its entirety. This is why we say that we have bodies. I mean, this is only logical, because for there to be experience, there has to be an experiencer, right? In fact, reason requires that everything that's ever been done has been done by a doer. That's why it's called reason. The apple growing is done by the apple tree, the apple falling is done by gravity, the person thinking is done by the person. But here we have a problem. The creation of every doer is also something that's been done. And since everything that's been done requires a doer, we need another doer. Realizing that this line of reasoning will just regress infinitely, reason required a doer of reality itself and called it God. God was seen as a designer, as someone with intentionality who knew what he was doing when he designed reality, and the intelligence of the design was taken as evidence for the intelligence of the designer. Fast forward to Darwin, and the notion of intelligent design completely loses its foothold. The most complex and intelligent structure in the observable universe, the human brain, is shown to have come about as the result of a very long, but nonetheless spontaneous and unintentional process of chemical evolution. From this point forwards, the difference between organic matter, life, and inorganic matter becomes a difference in complexity, not kind. And the world begins to seem to us more dead than ever. Even living things, when you zoom in far enough, are seen to be fundamentally dead, since the only doer that we find is, I guess, the laws of physics. And this is where we are at in modernity. Psychologically, we have replaced God with the laws of physics, and then kept the error, the assumption that it's a doer behind the deed. I mean, both God and the laws of physics are seen as a kind of puppeteer behind reality, pulling the strings and dictating how events unfold. They're seen as doing this by some kind of force. As is often said, the laws of physics govern reality, as though reality were at every step of the way under duress to conform and comply with these laws. In reality does what it does because it is what it is. There's no external force dictating how it should be. And the difference is that God knew what he was doing, whereas the laws of physics do not have any intentionality, so they're incapable of producing anything other than accidents. And so, science inevitably leads us to see ourselves as some kind of cosmic accident, even if the term accident is anthropomorphic and completely inapplicable. These laws also describe time itself as having a beginning in the past and an end in the future, which, besides being a contradiction in terms, leaves us envisioning ourselves as sort of sandwiched in between eternal nothingness and eternal nothingness. This is where we get nihilism. Nihil just means nothing. It's nothingism. The narrative that life is nothing but accidental chemical reactions, and that those reactions are occurring in a small sliver of a universe that came from nothingness and is inevitably going to nothingness. And there's just nobody at the driver's seat. In short, nothingism, or nihilism, is the recognition that our existence has nothing as its ultimate cause or purpose. Or to use more familiar first-person language, it's the discovery that I exist for no ultimate reason, and I have no ultimate purpose. At first, this problem of nihilism seems to be unsolvable. But according to Keiji Nishitani, the solution might be hidden in that sneaky word, I. That one word, I, signifies so much and yet completely eludes definition. Embedded in that one word are a million metaphysical assumptions that you don't even know that you have. For example, you might use the word I to refer to your personality. But then you also see your personality traits as things that you have. You also use the word I to invoke the doer of your deeds, as in, I went to the store. Or as the experiencer of your experiences, as in, I felt sad. Now if you pay attention, you'll notice that this concept, I, is context-dependent and constantly shifting around. When you're meditating and simply paying attention to your experiences, I tends to refer to the consciousness in which those experiences are arising. When you're socializing, I means the personality, or the narrative identity to which your name also refers. When you're performing a task, I just means the performer of that task. When you're thinking, I means the thinker of those thoughts. René Descartes said that I think, therefore I am, because he was thinking when he said it. Clearly this I is a very fluid concept. When you put water in a teacup, it becomes the teacup. So, from where does this I derive its fluidity? Why might it expand and shrink and change shape in simultaneous unison with its context? In every causal model, the cause is assumed to be more stable than its effects. Gravity can cause things to fall because gravity itself never falls. It's a figure of speech. So, if the doer, the I, existed first, and all its various deeds came after, as we assume in cause and effect, the cause comes first, then this single doer, this I, should be more consistent, more definite than all of its various effects, all its various deeds, right? And yet we find that it breaks this rule entirely. I is the most elusive and indefinite thing. Thoughts are easy to find, but the thinker of those thoughts seems to disappear the moment you look. So, let's look. Suppose for a moment that the doer, the I, doesn't exist in itself, but is rather, as Nietzsche said, a fiction added to the deed. In other words, suppose that the thinker is not really the cause of the thought, but rather that the appearance of the thought comes with the appearance of the thinker. And suppose that this happens simultaneously, such that the thinker is just the thought itself viewed from a different angle, or maybe interpreted by a different part of the brain. You can think about this in the same way that the sound of thunder is what the event of lightning looks like to your ears, despite being totally different to what that same event looks like to your eyes. Point being that the same event can have a completely different vibe depending on what device registers it, depending on the angle that you're looking at it. The difference being that there's a delay between seeing lightning and hearing the thunder, but the thought and the thinker arise simultaneously, making it far easier to get the causality of the whole thing backwards. Anyway, if it were the case that we are the thinkers of our thoughts, the causes of them, then you'd expect that thoughts would come when we want them to. But anyone who's ever tried being a human knows that that's just not how it works. Although it'd be nice if it did. But if the latter is the case, that the thinker is just what the thought looks like from a different angle, then this thinker would find that he has no control over what thought comes next. With that being said, in order to prove that this isn't true and that you really are the thinker of your thoughts, choose what your next thought is going to be. as you can see, despite being unable to shake the intuition that there is something called you that is the thinker of your thoughts, you cannot cause your thoughts at all. Even if you thought something like, I'm going to think of the ocean next, and then you thought of the ocean, did you choose to think, I'm going to think of the ocean next? Or did that plan itself just sort of appear? As Nietzsche said, the thought comes when it wants. Okay, but what about choosing what not to think next? Don't think about a pink elephant. You can't. And supposing that the thinker was an aspect of the thought, such that it was not separate from the thought itself, and most importantly was not the cause of the thought, but merely one of its interpretations, then this is exactly what we would expect to find. Okay, pause. So far we took a look at thoughts and we found that the phenomenology of thoughts aligns with precisely what we would expect if it were the case that you were not the thinker of your thoughts. But what about when I means the doer of your deeds, as in I went to the store? Did I freely cause the event of going to the store? Or is that interpretation just another fiction added to the event? Well, it makes sense to consider that the event of actually going to the store was caused by the decision to go to the store. And the I, in this context, means the decider of that decision. If the decider was really the cause of all decisions and not just a fiction added to the decision, then we might expect that the decider also decided to make a decision. You may remember deciding to make a decision at some point in your life, perhaps when debating some big life choice, but did a decision follow immediately after that? Or have you ever found that after deciding to make a decision on something really important, you are still unable to make that decision for some time? In reality, there is thinking, and then there is a decision. When there is thinking, you feel like the thinker. When there is a decision, you feel like the decider. And when there is a deed, you feel like the doer. All of this is exactly what we would expect if all of these so-called causes were actually just effects. If the whole notion of actors was just a way of interpreting activities. In simpler language, all of this is exactly what we would expect if you were not a thing in reality. Rather, just one of the many interpretations of reality itself. But hold on, if your sense of a separate self is just a false interpretation of reality, then who is the interpreter? Yet again, reason demands a doer behind the deed of interpretation. But the reality, again, is just far less intuitive. Your sense of being a separate self is an interpretation, but there is no single entity, no who or why or what that's doing the interpreting. There is an interpretation with no separate interpreter, which means that both the interpretation and the supposed interpreter are not separate things inside reality, but reality itself, which would mean that fundamentally you are not John or Dave or Lucy, you are reality. But what does this mean, to be reality? Alright, it gets even trickier from here, I apologize. Reality is not defined against anything else, for there is, by definition, nothing else to define it against. And if there is nothing else against which to define reality, then reality is, by definition, indefinite. Yeah, sorry. By definition, indefinite? We have reached our first paradox, which just means we've reached the limits of language, and so I'm going to have to try and speak in imagery instead. You define a circle by drawing its circumference, its edge. Once you have drawn this circle, you have an inside and an outside, a self and an other. But since anything outside of reality is not real, and therefore simply is not, reality cannot be drawn as a circle with everything in it, for this creates the existence of an outside which simply is not there. So reality can only be drawn as a completely blank sheet of paper. This is all to say that since reality itself is indefinite, since it has no edge, that means it has no circumference, so the center is everywhere. So why do I feel like I am Angelo? Because I am Angelo, because the center is everywhere. But by that exact same token, I am not Angelo, because the center is everywhere. Reality is by definition indefinite, which is to say it is edgeless. So as something real, Angelo is edgeless. And as something edgeless, Angelo as a separate subject with edges is not real. Insofar as you are real, you are not reality. Insofar as you are reality, you are not real. But hold on, to say insofar as you are real, you are not reality, is to say that insofar as you are real, you are separate from reality. But to be separate from reality is to not be real. So you can reduce the whole sentence down to insofar as you are real, you are not real. Yeah, language really doesn't work on this topic. Therefore, if you are real, which you are, you must be reality. And since you are reality, your sense of being a separate subject, of being John or Dave or Lucy, is misleading. It's a partial truth. To put it more accurately, your sense of being a separate self is a real appearance within you. You are not within your sense of being a separate self. Okay, if you haven't clicked off or thrown your device at a wall, then I'm very impressed, because there is no topic that's harder to talk about than non-duality. And there's a reason for it. All of our language, logic, common sense, and reason is downstream of a dualistic subject-object worldview. So we are actually incapable of forming thoughts or sentences without splicing up the continuum of reality into discrete objects and patterns to abstract them from the broader context. We call these slices things, and they are very useful measurements, just like inches. But just as you'll never find any inches outside of a human mind, you'll never find any things outside of a human mind either, including any separate selves, any independent entities. They're all useful illusions. Just as we divide a ruler into inches, we divide reality into things, and then make another error of positing those things as causes of the reality that they measure. To use Nietzsche's example, we say things like, the wave flashes, and we don't say that. We say the lightning flashes and the wave moves. But both of these sentences reference the same event twice, first as a cause, and then as an effect. In reality, the lightning is the flash, and the wave is the movement. To say that the wave moves is to think of the wave as a thing, something that's separate from the movement as its mover, in the exact same way that you think of yourself as separate from your thoughts as their thinker. But that theory doesn't have any more purchase on reality than the idea that the wave is a thing that moves. The mind has to make these separations and to imagine these things to be able to think and speak. It's a form of simplification, which is why my language completely broke down and became frustrating and paradoxical as soon as I tried to approach the topic. This non-separate, no-thing worldview is called non-duality, and it's been known, well, not known, more like seen, for millennia. For example, it's mentioned in the Upanishads, which are some of the first things humans ever wrote down. It is the cessation of all phenomena. It is all peace, all bliss, and non-dual. The soul is made of all that is near. It is made of all that is afar. This non-duality stuff is as ancient as it gets. But what does it have to do with nihilism? Nihilism, to speak in a very condensed way, is the perceived lack of ultimate grounds for existence. Grounds means many things here. It means justification, as in the grounds for action. It means the fundamental truth. It means the basis of morality. And metaphorically speaking, the ground is our source of stability and literally groundedness. It's what we're looking for when we're trying to get to the bottom of things. It's the irreducible basis of reality, the thing that we once called God. Nihilism is the loss of this ground, which is why it's often depicted as a sort of abyss underneath our feet. As I formulated it earlier, it's the discovery that I exist for no ultimate reason, and I have no ultimate purpose. Even more than that, nihilism is the discovery that nothing is ultimate. It's come about largely as a side effect of science, which has got very good at getting to the bottom of things and then wondering where its highest sentiments have gone. Nietzsche was the first philosopher to look this abyss in the eye without flinching, and to advocate a heroic and tragic affirmation of life despite the abyss. But Keiji Nishitani, as I said, thought that Nietzsche didn't go far enough. From Nishitani's Eastern standpoint, to stand against the abyss, willingly or not, is still to consider yourself to be a separate subject apart from the abyss. To separate the seer from the seen, and thereby to be subjected to it. This interpretation views the nothingness at the ground of reality as only a relative nothingness, as negation. That's to say, nothingness as opposed to existence. something that is nothingness because it is not existence, rather than the non-dual truth which completely closes that gap and sees the no-thingness as existence itself. Both Nishitani and Nietzsche traced this error back to the fundamental separation of subjects and objects and predicates that's sort of at the basis of the grammar of how we even think. It's literally axiomatic of logic itself. And so it becomes unavoidable that every product of existential thought is bound to see the nothingness of nihilism as a relative nothingness. And by virtue of it being a relative nothingness, as a something that is nothingness, that's other than, separate from, behind, or underneath reality, it will always be antithetical to existence, in opposition to it. In short, it will always be an argument against existence itself. The mind can only conceptualize of nothingness as something that is nothingness because it is not existence. Here we see the dualism of thinking as clear as day. The mind cannot grasp anything without defining it against what it's not. So you can't think about nothing except as the absence of everything. But that is not absolute nothingness, because the absence itself remains. The concept still has an edge, still has a circumference and a center, therefore it's still got a shape, it's still a thing. But absolute nothingness, no-thingness, is not a thing that is at the ground of reality. It's not after death or before the Big Bang. Rather, what's closer to the truth is that no-thingness is reality. It is self-identical with existence itself. That's to say that there are no self-contained things in existence, including you. Nothing is separate and independent. Nothing can exist except as everything else. And therefore you were not a thing that was born, and you are not a thing that will die either. The appearance of you will come and go. It's temporal. Everything is constantly becoming. Nothing is static. But 5-year-old you is already dead, and he didn't seem to mind. Because he, like you today, is just an appearance. A real appearance, but an appearance, not a thing. This absolute no-thingness is not an argument against reality, nor is it something that's hostile to existence, but rather it is reality, and it is existence, which means that it is you. And when you pass through to this perspective, it completely changes the interpretation of nihilism in a way that I can only express through tone of voice. It's the difference between nothing is ultimate and nothing is ultimate. The statement is no longer a negation, it's a marriage. In his book, Religion and Nothingness, Nishitani frequently mentions the Mahayana Buddhist notion of sunyata, or shunyata, which just means emptiness. As the old Buddhist saying goes, emptiness is form, form is emptiness. Another paradoxical statement of language that's trying to point you away from language. Anyway, to avoid confusing you any further, I'll summarize Nishitani's way forwards through nihilism with another metaphor. Where Nietzsche stood against the abyss, Nishitani recommends jumping into it, and realizing that no-thingness is not something that you are subjected to, it is you already. And even this it is a misleading word. And since shunyata, emptiness, no-thingness, is what you actually are, we can answer the question from the beginning of the video, are you real, with a fittingly paradoxical answer. Yes and no. Purposelessness is only purposelessness when you are subjected to it. When you are it, it's called freedom. But how do you actually dissolve this subject-object duality? How do you get rid of that dualistic lens? Well, it's not something you can do with your mind, or your intellect, or with logic or reason. It's not something you can do as an act of will. In fact, it's not something that you can do at all. But there are things that can be noticed, and patterns that can appear, and the best way to notice is to pay attention, to meditate. Traditions like Zen Buddhism have a whole host of meditation practices and koans, which are kind of like many of the paradoxical sentences you found in this video, that are sort of designed to nudge you in a certain direction. But whether or not you have a full-blown non-dual experience and realize you were never born and you'll never die and all of that fun stuff, the things you notice about free will and about identity and your sense of self while meditating can undoubtedly unravel some of the stickiness that is part and parcel of having a hyperactive human mind that's constantly narrativizing and separating and categorizing reality into things that then become sort of perceived as threats to the organism. And these changes can undoubtedly change your relationship with the cultural nihilism of today in a very profound way. So I strongly recommend it. Anyway, I'm sorry if this video was frustrating or pissed you off. I'm trying to point you towards something that can't be put into words by using words. So it gets tricky. If you want to read more about Nietzsche's metaphysics of the world of becoming, then I highly recommend checking out the chapter called The Will to Power as Knowledge from his book of unpublished notes called The Will to Power. Or alternatively, if you want to do a proper deep dive, you can try Religion and Nothingness by Keiji Nishitani. But if non-duality and Buddhism and the sort of Eastern worldview is completely new to you, then that book will probably be quite tricky, but you can use ChatGPT to help you out. Anyway, I hope this video gave you some food for thought when it comes to nihilism and your sense of self. And I will see you next time. Adios.